What is the scariest experience you have gone through? Witnessing my only parent overdosing. I was 10 or 11 years old. Although it was years ago, I remember exactly how it went. It was a normal night. She was in her room, as always, with her boyfriend. I was waiting for her to come out and watch TV with me. It was nighttime. Suddenly, I heard a very loud thump, and her boyfriend started screaming. Terrified, I tried to go into her room, but the door was locked. I was scared, so I hid on the couch. A few seconds later, her boyfriend came running out, talking on the phone. He started taking things out of the house, throwing items around to create a path to the door. I kept asking him what was wrong, but he ignored me. I grew more upset because he wouldn't let me see her. I ran to her room, and the door was open. There she lay on the floor, her eyes rolled completely back. I stood there in shock, staring. I thought she was dead. Moments later, I heard the ambulance outside, and her boyfriend picked me up and placed me on the couch as I watched them carry her out on a stretcher. I was so confused and scared that I cried and looked out the window as they drove away with her. Shortly afterward, my neighbors came over, and I stayed at their house until my parent recovered. Nobody explained to me what had happened. I was terrified for weeks and couldn't sleep. Then one day, she called me. I thought she had died. A few months later, my grandmother told me that she had overdosed on drugs. I will never be the same from that experience, and I'm so thankful she's okay. A friend of my girlfriend shared her flat with a fellow student. Let's call her Miley. Miley met a guy on Tinder. He initially seemed super nice, but lived on the other side of the country. After months of chatting, they decided to meet in person. He traveled with a suitcase, which he took everywhere they went. She felt quite uncomfortable in his presence and decided to end the date. At the end, she opened up about her feelings and told him she didn't think this was going to work. He thanked her for her honesty and decided to head back home. When she arrived back at her flat, he texted her saying that his train's departure was canceled and asked if he could sleep at her place. At first, she denied the request but felt quite miserable because he had traveled a long way only to be rejected, so she agreed. She offered him the couch and locked her bedroom door. Later, she said there was something about his presence. In the middle of the night, she noticed the door handle moving. She texted her roommate that the guy was trying to enter her room. Her roommate called the cops, who advised her to tell Miley to keep the door closed as long as possible. She didn't want to arouse his suspicions and asked him what he was trying to do. He said he only wanted to ask for a blanket and asked her to please open the door. A few horrific minutes later, the cops slammed the door and arrested him, freeing her from the room. One officer told her, "Do not enter the living room for God's sake." But of course, out of curiosity and adrenaline, she did anyway. The guy had covered the floor with a plastic sheet and prepared several knives. End of the story. Miley has trust issues and needs a therapist. This story gave me chills. A few years back, I was into aviation and trying to get my private certification, a part of which requires a number of cross-country flights. These flights are meant to be at a minimum of 30-ish minutes each way. I forget the exact nautical mile numbers. But being the hyper-involved student I hadn't planned for my first one to be at night. It was mostly lovely on the way there, with the sun setting and very calm weather. We turned around as the sun was just going down, so it got dark pretty quickly afterward. This shouldn't have been an issue because my CFI, certified flight instructor, was instrument trained, and it was a relatively clear night. Partway through the flight, my CFI had me put on instrument goggles, which are meant to force you to fly on instruments alone, meaning I couldn't see out of the plane. So, I didn't know what happened initially or where it came from. But out of nowhere, and quite uncharacteristically, my CFI took control and told me to look out my window. I obliged, expecting to see fireworks, as he thought that's what it was. Looking out the window, I didn't see fireworks. It was a flashing light flying toward our plane, quickly closing the distance. It must have had both forward and sideways momentum to approach us the way it did, but it just kept getting closer and closer until it was maybe an arm's length from the wing on the side it was coming from, and then it blinked out. To this day, I have no idea what it was or why it happened. But I know I wasn't the only one who saw it because my CFI and I discussed it during our debrief. I definitely thought the plane was about to get hit with something, and we might have to make an emergency landing, or worse. Two incidents stand out as the scariest for me. About 10 to 12 years ago, this happened multiple times. I was living with my parents, and someone attempted to break into our front door. My dad would be in the living room, watching TV, and he'd hear noises, like someone walking up the front steps and attempting to open the screen door. Fortunately, we kept both the screen door and the main door locked. One time, he looked out the window and saw someone running away. Meanwhile, I was in my bedroom and heard someone walking around on the deck. The sound of heavy work boots on a wooden deck is unmistakable. Our house is only fenced in on 3 sides because it has a long driveway extending to the backyard, which ends in a detached garage. The window in my bedroom is right over the deck. The second scary incident was related to my blood sugar dropping dangerously low. At the time, I was working in retail at self-checkouts. Unfortunately, my coworker, who was supposed to cover my lunch break, called in sick. The supervisor said there was no one else available to cover, but she'd see what she could do. I ended up working for 7 hours and 15 minutes of an 8-hour shift before finally getting my lunch break. As a diabetic, this was a critical situation. It took 10 glucose tablets, the ones that are pure sugar and raise blood sugar levels, a protein bar, and a large lunch to bring my blood glucose back up to 70. Normal range is between 70 and 100. I was shaking, lightheaded, dizzy, sweating, and felt like I might pass out. I knew that if I did, there was a good chance I could die right there at work. After that incident, I followed my doctor's advice and reduced my hours so that I wouldn't work long enough to miss lunch breaks anymore. Losing my younger sibling to cancer. We were fortunate enough to be able to bring them home to die. My mom, older sibling, and I acted as palliative care nurses, working in shifts to keep my younger sibling comfortable. My mom is actually a nurse, so that helped a lot. But witnessing the incredibly violent seizures, having unexpected power cuts, and having to race to hook up pure oxygen tanks to prevent my sibling from suffocating, that was terrifying. Reading to them, and they would suddenly open their mouth super wide and gasp as if taking their last breath, with their inner mouth being pure red and their skin ghostly white. I remember screaming for my mom in absolute terror, losing them when they passed, and their body began to go through livor mortis almost instantly. I had never been exposed to death before that, so it was terrifying. The marbling of their skin, the compulsory embalming due to the rate of decay from cancer, haunts me the most. I still have nightmares. My sibling died a child, and it was a horrible reminder that death doesn't care whether you're a child or not. I grew up as the black sheep in a wealthy family. Anytime I tried to express a desire to work for anything, I was jokingly chastised and made to feel foolish for not relying on our family's money. There were also issues with my addict brother that led to a pivotal night. One day, I discovered that my quiet brother was stealing from me. I informed my parents. He was 22 at the time, and I was 19, back from college. My parents assured me they would handle it. However, 2 weeks later, he had stolen approximately $2,000 worth of items from me, and nothing had been done. One night, I confronted him about it. I want to emphasize that I wasn't aggressive in my approach. His twin and my dad immediately intervened, scolding me for even asking him. His twin cornered me, and I pushed him away. They interpreted this as violence and proceeded to tackle me down. I endured a beating from my dad and brother until I managed to wrestle them off. After that terrifying incident, I walked 2 miles to my grandmother's house. I stayed with her until I could move out completely. I'm currently trying to repair my relationship with my family, but that night still haunts me. The next day, I was working as a waiter and had to tell my tables that I was mugged. Technically, I had been beaten up and had money stolen from me, so it wasn't entirely a lie. When I was 18, my mom was in the ICU for a month. She eventually came out of the ICU and was moved to a regular room, seemingly getting better. Despite having a college scholarship, I hesitated to leave her side, but she insisted I go to college, so I reluctantly did. It felt like my one shot, you know? On the second day of classes, I received a 5 a.m. call. My mom had arrested. She had no living will, so they resuscitated her, but she remained on life support with no brain activity. At 18, I had to sign the papers to turn off the machines. She was my only family. Now, at 51, Tears well up as I write this. I grapple with the feeling that I somehow caused her death. Yes, I know she was brain dead, and the neurologist confirmed it. I've had counseling, but the weight remains. I signed those papers, they switched off the machines, and my mother passed away. And suddenly, I was alone. My advice: make a living will. Spare your loved ones the agony I went through. When I was 10, someone broke into my house. My mom, my little sister, and I lived alone, except for weekends when my stepdad stayed over. That night, of course, he didn't stay. We always double-checked, and still do, that the doors were locked due to my anxiety. But that day, my mom forgot. Around midnight, my mom came into my room and whispered, "There's a man in the house." My 10-year-old brain immediately went into panic mode. "Oh, are we gonna die?" My mom tried to calm me down, but it was impossible. I was terrified. She called my stepdad first, but he didn't answer. Desperate for help, she even called my sister's dad, whom she disliked, but he didn't answer either. Finally, we dialed the police. As it turned out, the guy was just drunk and had entered the wrong house. He lived in the apartment next to ours and had mistaken our home for his. While I felt bad for him, the situation was still horrifying. I can only imagine how embarrassed he must have been when he woke up the next day. I got rolled by some very angry dudes armed with hunting rifles in Birmingham, Alabama. There was a massive misunderstanding about something the other two people I was traveling with did, and we were separated at the time, so I took the fall. I didn't know what in the hell was going on when they rolled me in a truck and started screaming about beating me to a pulp if I didn't tell them where my friends were. They were threatening to kill my friends, and there was this super bizarre, high-octane moment where I used a freight train to separate myself from them and run. They were not messing around. There was no doubt in my mind I was dead meat. I ended up in a creek bed on the phone with my road dogs, telling them to make themselves scarce now when the truck showed up again, 15 feet away on the road. I made a split-second decision and left my gear in the creek so I could run through the woods easier. I spent a long time hiding and freaking out while they looked for me, hooting and hollering all the while. I had a can of Dr. Pepper in my vest and I was so thirsty but didn't want to make noise pulling the tab back. Eventually, it quieted down and I knew I had to get my gear. The worst-case scenario was that they'd found it and either took it or, even worse, were waiting by it until I returned in hopes of doing me some serious harm. Luckily, it was untouched, though my whole backpack was soaked through. I tiptoed away to find my friends who were hiding deep in the woods a couple of miles away. There's been other stuff and maybe worse stuff, but the Birmingham Bonanza was the most recent. We'd gone to an island for Christmas. It was the day before my daughter's second birthday, and we, along with my wife's sister, her husband, and their child, decided to visit one of the spectacular waterfalls. A proper welded-together Mad Max truck took us halfway up the mountain, and we had to walk the rest of the way. My almost 2-year-old had to be carried, so I picked her up and walked up the trail. It wasn't far before I lost my footing on the damp leaves, fell, and, still holding my girl, began to slide. I had no real concerns. After all, I've fallen plenty, but I continued to slide. Holding my daughter's head with one hand, I grabbed at everything I could with the other but kept sliding relentlessly. I glanced over my shoulder to see a drop just meters away. A big drop, an unsurvivable drop with nothing to stop us from falling. I rolled onto my back with my daughter, crying on my chest, holding her tight with the hope that she, at least, would be okay. At the very edge, I managed to push my foot into the vegetation that grew there. We stopped sliding. My wife and brother-in-law scrambled down towards us, took my daughter from my arms, and carried her away. I stayed there, entangled in the bushes, and smoked 2 cigarettes silently, with one leg dangling over the cliff. I didn't speak at all for the rest of the day. When we visited the temple for her birthday the next morning, we meant it. When I, female, was 18, I worked at a video rental store, not Blockbuster, and quickly made friends with a coworker who also happened to be my manager. He invited me to his apartment, which happened to be in the most dangerous area of the city, for the first time after work, along with 2 other male coworkers whom I didn't know very well. I was still somewhat new and hadn't worked with them much. I didn't have a car, so my manager/friend, offered to drive me there and take me home after the gathering. The first thing that happened when we all got there and settled on the couch was that I was offered a bunch of shrooms. This was my first time doing shrooms, so I was a little nervous but went ahead and tried them. I naively accepted a drink from him too. I don't recall much of what happened after taking the shrooms and drinking whatever that drink was, as I started going in and out of consciousness. When I came to very early the next morning, I was without any clothes in his bed with him and the two co-workers. I jumped up out of the bed and started freaking out. This woke my friend, who gave me the creepiest smile and said, "Why? Good morning, beautiful." I asked him what happened, and he just said, "You're a real freak." I demanded he take me home immediately, and he agreed and put his clothes on. I was frantically putting my clothes on and gathering my stuff. I was already walking to the front door when I turned around to see if he was ready. He was smiling and holding a gun to my forehead. Time just froze. I have no other way to describe it. I just stared back at him, mouth open in shock. He started laughing and said, "It's not loaded. I just wanted to see what your reaction would be." He then began taking his shoes off and went to sit on the couch, turning the TV on. I was still in shock and realized he wasn't planning on driving me home. So I had no choice but to just turn around and leave. I ended up having to walk to my apartment, which was about 2 miles away, through the most dangerous part of town. I recall someone in a car driving past me, yelling, "You're gonna get robbed," as I walked as fast as I could. I finally made it home and broke down into tears. I remember falling to my knees and just weeping. I was naive and didn't report him or the two co-workers, and I didn't tell anyone about what happened except my boyfriend, now husband, years later. I immediately quit that job and haven't seen or heard from any of those assholes again. Looking back now that I'm 41, I should have called the police, but I somehow thought I deserved what happened to me. It's hard to explain, but I honestly blamed myself for being so naive and putting myself in that situation. I fully understand now that it wasn't my fault. It's still the scariest, most traumatic situation I've been through, and I've had some pretty traumatic situations happen before and since. I grew up thinking my house was haunted. Weird shit would happen all the time. I'd walk into rooms and lights would turn on. I'd go to the kitchen in the middle of the night and find cupboards open. I'd hear footsteps upstairs when I was home alone. I'd feel the ghost sit down on the bed while I was trying to sleep. You know, typical, haunting, stuff that would freak any kid out. Then I had a stalker who started getting weird when I was in my late teens. Turns out it was much, much worse than I could have imagined. The stalker was actually a peeping Tom who had been watching me since I was, possibly as young as 7. As it turns out, there was no ghost and the house wasn't haunted. The psycho was breaking in when I was home alone and messing with me. As a little kid, as I got older, he got bolder. He'd come in at night when my parents were home and even sit on my bed while I was trying to sleep. I'm pretty sure he found where my mom stashed the extra key and just made a copy. We never caught the guy. The cops said it was just some high school boy making jokes. I've had lots of therapy. I suffered from an illness with no name for years. When I got sick, I would piss blood and be violently ill. I didn't have a problem as I was told I was going to grow out of it, childhood nephritis. So imagine my shock when I hit 19 and felt like shit, like I was going to die. I went to the doctor's office to see a general practitioner, and they had closed early for a Christmas party, but I forced them to open the door to deal with me. The general practitioner said, "We need an ambulance now," and I was forced into the ambulance and down to the ER. While in the ER, they took blood and found I was suffering from hyperkalemia, too much potassium in my blood, which was causing my heart rate to hit the 200s. I was on the verge of a stroke or heart attack. I was admitted to the hospital and immediately put on drugs to lower the levels so I wouldn't die, but I kept vomiting black bile. I thought, this is it. This is how I die. Not doing something heroic or awesome, but in a hospital bed alone, vomiting and wanting nothing more than my mom and dad. Honestly, I was scared out of my mind and couldn't stop crying. Apparently, after that, I was put into a medical coma, pumped full of more drugs, and given emergency dialysis. My kidneys had failed, and I was dying of blood poisoning. When I woke up, I had missed my birthday, and it was roughly 2 weeks later. I had a dialysis machine attached to a chest line and a dialysis nurse trying to keep me calm, but I was choking to death. So I ended up pulling the ventilator out of my mouth, and this long pipe came with it. I started to cough violently and almost vomited, but there was nothing to come out, so I just dry heaved a lot and pulled a lot of muscles. Later, I was told my kidneys had failed. I was lucky to be alive and doubly lucky that I didn't clot and suffer a stroke or a heart attack. I was as weak as a newborn and could barely lift my arms after a while. I remained in the hospital for 3 months, getting rehabilitation because I couldn't speak properly or walk properly. After 6 months, I was basically back to being me, just struggling with this new condition that had basically ruined my life and my plans. I got caught in a rock slide and fell off a cliff while backpacking. It was early spring, and things were starting to melt. We were hiking on a ridge and looking for a way down the side, maybe a 60 to 70 degree loose scree slope, to a stream about 500 feet below. I was in the lead, heading down at an angle, when rocks kicked out from under my feet and I fell backwards onto my butt. All of a sudden, the entire slope around me began to move en masse, like an island of broken up rocks with me sitting in the middle. I rode it down the hill, bouncing off stuff and trying to stop myself and dig in, but no luck. I just kept picking up speed. At the bottom, the hill dropped off to a 40-foot cliff, and I was launched off with the slide. I landed in a pile of debris and loose stuff that had previously come down, including a lot of loose snow, which mostly absorbed the energy. I was mostly okay, muddy, with lots of scratches and bruises, a separated shoulder, and a broken tailbone, but I was able to walk out. My one memory is being in midair, time standing still, and looking to my left at a stove-sized boulder likewise suspended in the air, about 6 feet away. Any good-sized rock would have killed me. A morning within a few days of Christmas Eve, my oldest son, he was 4 at the time, had flu-like symptoms that turned terrifying. We were relaxing, watching TV, as he was out of it, and I was lucky my wife recognized the warning signs. His stomach was sucking in and extending with each breath. It kicked in that he was struggling to breathe. We called 911, and they said that while we waited for responders, we should take him out into the cold air without a jacket, as it might help his congestion somehow. My wife was on the phone, and I was standing in the driveway holding my little boy. He was gasping now, his face taking on a tinge of blue, and all I could do was hold him and tell him it was okay, that it was going to be all right, and to stay calm and take nice big breaths. I felt so powerless and small, and all I could do was hold him, soothe him, and wait, trying not to lose my composure for his sake. The firefighters arrived first and rushed up our yard with oxygen. They cheered for him and told him what a brave boy he was and that everything was going to be all right. My wife went into the ambulance with him while they kept him on oxygen, and they drove off because we had our second son, a baby at the time. I called my dad to come watch him, and he was over in an instant and drove to the hospital. The whole time there, I didn't know what my boy was going through or if he was okay. When I got there, he was doing great. Some steroids did the trick, and after a fun time hanging out with the doctors, we went home the same night with some precautionary meds. I collapsed in my wife's arms while taking a shower after he fell asleep, trying not to let my big, ugly sobs wake him up. I've never felt so powerless in my life, and it was the scariest thing I've ever gone through, including other situations where I thought I might die. The 9/11 terrorist attacks. I was 16 at the time, about to drop out of high school, and a group of friends and I heard on the news that the Windows on the World restaurant was holding open interviews all week. Naturally, we met up at our high school, Lafayette High School, in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. I don't remember what time we left, but by the time we got to the financial district in Manhattan, the first plane had already hit the first tower. As we walked out of the subway, I instantly saw the smoke and kept walking toward the towers. Seconds later, the second airplane hit. Time moved so fast after that. I got separated from my friends in the mayhem and was fixated on the towers burning. Then the towers started to collapse. I ran toward the ferry depot and found a boat that was going to Brooklyn. I don't know how I made it home before 3 p.m., my normal time home from school, but I have kept it a secret from my family for 20 years now. I almost died cutting class, and my family would have never known. I'm still gutted by all I have seen and feel guilty that I was able to get away. I haven't seen those friends since, but I do know they aren't among the dead. When I was 11 years old, My neighbor used a bulldozer to clear part of the wooded area on his property. For context, we lived in a very rural area. Although our property lines touched at the back end, it would have taken 20 minutes to walk from our driveway to theirs. In that wooded area, where our neighbors generally allowed us to play, I had constructed a little hiding place. It was nestled in a hollow in the ground, surrounded by a big stump and some fallen trees. On the day of the bulldozing, I stood at the edge of the wooded area and had the stupidest idea of my life. Why not watch from my hiding place? I climbed in while my neighbor faced the other direction. Through a large peephole, I watched as he disappeared behind the massive stump, the main wall of my hiding spot. But then something strange happened. Why didn't he reappear on the other side? The stump began moving toward me at what felt like light speed. Horror flooded me as my feet got caught under the clay-clumped roots. I fell backward, screaming. With the bulldozer's noise, no one would hear me. I tried shaking bushes to catch my neighbor's attention, but he remained oblivious. The stump continued its relentless advance, sometimes pausing as the dozer repositioned, but always resuming its terrifying movement. It couldn't have taken long, yet it felt like hours. I believed I was going to die, buried under earth and debris, with no one knowing what happened. Then, miraculously, the stump stopped. The bulldozer shut off, and suddenly I could hear my own screams. My neighbor ran over. My sisters and mom sprinted down from our house, and even my dog Cookie was there, licking my face for some reason. 3 hours, 20 volunteer firefighters, 2 jaws of life, and an ambulance later, I discovered why I was alive. My scruffy little schnauzer, Cookie, the true hero, had come to save me. I'm tearing up just typing this. Maybe she heard my screams or was already nearby, but she jumped on top of the stump, barking at the bulldozer as if it were a mountain lion ready to devour me. My neighbor, not wanting to harm her, cut off the machine and finally heard my desperate cries for help. My injuries weren't too severe, considering the circumstances. A broken leg in a couple of places, several surgeries, and a few months in a wheelchair. Cookie and I made the front page in every city in the county, and 2 different feed companies awarded her a year's supply of dog food. My sweet puppy is no longer with us, but she'll always be the best dog I could ever have. I miss you, girl, and thank you. Well, I've got 2 actually. The first one happened when I was 10. I was in England at a summer camp. One afternoon, my friends and I were walking from lunch to our bedrooms when we decided to take a different route through a sort of forest. We got lost and kept walking for about 8 hours until it was dark. Some of the kids tried climbing trees to look for any lights from houses, but they couldn't. The pines were almost 12 meters high. Finally, I don't know how, we found a dirt path that took us to a road where we asked a man for help. The second one happened when I was 15. I was on an airplane traveling from Bogota, Colombia, to New York. When the airplane was over Cuba, it started going in circles without any explanation. The crew was laughing at everything, as if they were high. They were all from the United States, so they were talking in English among themselves, and I couldn't understand what they were saying. Finally, when we got to the US, it was raining, and I literally felt how the plane was falling, not descending slowly. People were screaming. I am not exaggerating. I got to New York safely, as if nothing had happened. Apart from being scary, it was a weird situation. This is an experience I have never forgotten. I have only shared it with a few people, my best friends. One of them was there with me, and the other I've known for about 10 years. I am a Nigerian American who was sent to a boarding school in Abia State, Nigeria, in 2008 due to my bad behavior. My parents were very strict. Boarding school life in Africa can be intense, especially since it was an all-boys school. Our campus was located near a church, surrounded by acres of bush and wilderness. Tall walls and gates kept intruders out. One night, around 4 a.m., I woke up to use the restroom. Phones weren't allowed, so I couldn't check the time precisely. Nigeria's unreliable electricity meant that all the lights were out. Usually, I'd wake up my other American best friend to accompany me to the restroom. We were both scared. Imagine 2 14-year-olds navigating the dark. I woke him up, and he agreed to come along. As we walked down the hall, we noticed that nobody else was awake, quite unusual in a boarding school where many students shared a room. On my way back from the restroom, I reached my bed first. Just as I was about to lie down, I heard the loudest and most terrifying sound. It froze me in place. The eerie laugh seemed straight out of an old cartoon, like an evil villain's cackle. It echoed throughout the entire building, deep and raspy. My friend bolted back to his bed, and we didn't speak until morning. He had heard it too. Strangely, nobody else in our room seemed to have noticed, but students in other rooms reported hearing something similar. The next day, we learned that the Catholic school priest had been walking around the campus, sprinkling holy water and praying. This was the second supernatural event in my life. It remains a vivid memory. My best friend and I rarely discuss it, but we both know it wasn't an ordinary animal in the woods. The sound was more like a booming announcement from a loudspeaker at a Burning Man event. To this day, some people don't believe our story, and that's perfectly fine. Probably one of the scariest experiences I've ever had was when my family and I heard things being thrown and destroyed on the second floor of our house. Context: I live in Mexico, specifically in Tamaulipas, a very dangerous part of the country where violent crimes are an everyday occurrence. Naturally, we were worried about the strange noises coming from above. This happened around 2 a.m., if I remember correctly. My brother, my mother, and I decided to investigate. I grabbed a knife, and my brother took a sharp screwdriver for protection. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to break into our house. We moved carefully and quietly upstairs. As we approached the door, the noises grew louder, like someone was throwing dishes and kicking the walls. Then we noticed that the door was actually locked. That was odd. Why would a burglar lock the door from the inside? It made no sense. Nevertheless, I opened the door, and suddenly, silence. Not a single thing was broken or out of place. Everything appeared fine. The noises vanished. It was incredibly eerie because we never received a real answer about what caused all that commotion or why it abruptly stopped when we opened the door. Strange occurrences have always happened in my house, but nothing as unsettling as that day.